So I've made a video in absolutely ages, and I've been promising the people that I tutor that I was going to do a video about these 25 mark essays. There is some debate over this part of the mark scheme and talking about clear links between several different topics and the theme of the question. Some people say you shouldn't link your paragraphs, some people say you should. And hopefully this technique just covers all bases, and it means we can show that we're linking topics together, as well as linking it back to the theme of the question. So first of all then, if I scroll down, these are our steps. First step is obviously going to be, we're going to decide on the question out of the two that we're given. And then what we're going to do, what I recommend we should do, is write down all the topics that you think are relevant to that question. And that's what we've done here. The student that I did this with, I've basically typed up the paper notes onto a Word document just to make it neater. This is what that student thought was relevant. And you guys can pause it and have a think about how these topics obviously link to ions. With a bit of guidance we spoke about together, we also highlighted the role of these ions, and there's a brief sort of summary of what we could talk about in relation to those ions in terms of those topics that you can have a think about. And like I say, you could pause or look through your notes or whatever it might be that you need. Then the next step, just coming down to here, is going to be you pick your strongest 4 or 5 topics. Now remember, all of this is individual. Some people are going to be able to write way faster and way more than others in the sort of allotted 30, 35 minutes that most people tend to go with. I also recommend doing this straight away. As soon as you open paper 3, go to this essay, get it done whilst you're fresh, and then you can sort of bank those marks, hopefully. If you practice these so often, you can bank those marks, and then you've got sort of at least 20 marks in the bank out of 25 before you even attempt to tackle the rest of the paper. So this was the order. This was our initial plan. You might want to draw a few or write a few annotations, maybe muscles. You might want to talk about troponin or tropomyosin, I should say. Sliding filament theory, for example, neurons, you might put SPP next to it. Obviously, that's up to you how you want to do a quick plan, and it depends how quickly you can work, because time's obviously pressing in an exam. We changed the order slightly, and that's going to become apparent why we did that when we look through this. I'm not going to go through all this detail because you can just pause. And remember, these are just recommendations, and this is what we decide to go with in that tutoring session. You might want to talk about different aspects of neurons and how they relate to ions. But there's some guidance there, some things that you might want to write about. The main thing I wanted to talk about was that connecting conclusion and the idea that you could talk about synapses, then the neuromuscular junction. Then you could say if Ca2 plus is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum as a result of that nerve impulse moving down T tubules, then that leads us perfectly onto paragraph 2, talking about muscles. So that's sort of addressing that aspect of the specification, linking topics together. I won't talk about muscles. I'll put the detail about the specification not actually requiring knowledge of troponin, but I'm sure some of your teachers would have mentioned troponin as well. Could do sliding filament theory, like we said there. And this is where it gets really important. You've got to acknowledge what the question's asking. You've got to acknowledge that they're asking about the importance of ions in relation to biology. And I've just gone for this particular direction, talking about by contracting muscles, we can avoid danger, hunt, or even muscle contraction of involuntary muscles like the diaphragm or the intercostal muscles, obviously allows us to breathe. That's the one particular, well, there, some of the examples I'd go for personally, but you might think of another reason that muscle contraction is so important. But what you really need to identify and acknowledge is the fact that muscle contraction wouldn't happen without ions. And that's linking and addressing the question, the idea of the importance of ions. Paragraph 3, this particular student decided to go with the sodium-potassium pump in relation to the ileum. And then obviously all the details there, as you guys would know, you'd have it in your notes in your textbook. But again, we could connect that, and as you start to learn the spec in a bit more detail, you'll start to see all these links between the topics and the overall, or the umbrella sort of concepts and the bigger picture in biology. You'll make these links much faster once you start practicing these often. I went for the idea of glucose being absorbed in the ileum into the blood, and then we can deliver that glucose to cells and allow them to respire. And that takes us nicely onto what was originally in our plan, photosynthesis and respiration. We're obviously just going to focus on respiration because we're taking an animal route for this particular answer to this particular question. There's the detail. Could talk about glycolysis, link, Krebs. And remember, you've got to manage your time correctly. So some people can go into a lot more detail because they have more time to play with. And that's why practice is so important. You'll figure out how much you can write and how much content you can show off. Because remember, that's the important thing with exams. Examiners don't know you know it unless you write it down. And that sounds really obvious to say, but you just have to get it down on paper. And the more you practice, the quicker you can write, and therefore the more you can show off all that knowledge that you've been working really hard to remember, and obviously put in your exam answers. So I've just acknowledged here, remember, or just here, remember NAD and FAD, they're hydrogen atom carriers. And then those atoms split into the protons. And we'd obviously focus on those protons in a fair bit of detail because that's what the question's asking. It's asking us about ions. So we're going to talk about those H plus ions and the H plus gradient, which is then used for chemiosmosis and making ATP. And there we go. There's the final reference back to the question in the sort of final part of that paragraph. We're saying without those H plus ions carrying out the function that they're doing, we wouldn't have ATP, and therefore we wouldn't be able to carry out. These are just, a small range of biological functions that are essential that wouldn't take place if we didn't have ATP. But we wouldn't have ATP if it wasn't for H plus ions. And that's really demonstrating that you read the question and you understand what they're asking. You're not just writing everything you know about 4 or 5 topics. You're making sure that you're writing relevant content down that's A-level specific, and it's relevant to the question. And obviously it needs to be accurate, because if we just finally look here, no significant errors or irrelevant material, needs to be A-level content. And what I'd finally say about for top marks in the band, the answer shows evidence of reading beyond specification requirements. That is a tricky one. What I would recommend, you could possibly look up a few sort of external, beyond the specification bits of information, small bits of information, because you really don't have enough time to put loads in, maybe about respiration or maybe about the sodium potassium pump. Just there. If you were to get additional information in many of these exam answers or these essay answers, you're going to be speaking about sodium potassium pump and definitely respiration. So that could be a way that you make sure you've got additional information beyond the A-level specification. But I recommend to everyone, don't worry about that final aspect of the mark scheme. Chances are, if you're pushing for 24 or 25 out of 25, you're going to know a lot of stuff outside the specification anyway. And I really recommend to people not spend absolutely tons of time reading up outside the specification, because you want to be focusing on making sure, just coming back here, that the biology is detailed, A-level content, and most importantly is accurate and error-free. That's what you want to be focusing on. And if you get those final 2 marks for having information outside of the specification, then so be it. There's our summary. I'm keeping it under 10 minutes. So thanks so much. Like and subscribe to. I'm only joking. I don't really want a YouTube channel like that. But thanks. Hope you found it useful.